So hello, everyone. It's really nice to see so many new as well as known faces on Zoom today. And thank you for joining from many countries in Europe, North and South America, and as far as India and Australia for our 13th virtual coffee for yogi, reflecting on our practice during this multi-year-long pandemic. Just one housekeeping, another one of the housekeeping instruction. Please stay muted and we will leave time for your question. So please go to the reaction and raise your virtual hand or put your question in the chat, and we'll leave about 15 minutes for Stephanie to answer your questions. So why this conversation? So let me just introduce why this conversation. We are in the second year of the pandemic, the length of which was not anticipated, and we are still asking ourselves, how do we find and cultivate resilience? How do we continue to maintain our health and spirit and even strive in this situation? So this global conversation aimed to give us perspective on our lives in the time of COVID. Some of us live in societies with different responses to COVID. Some have opened the society and some needed to close them again as the COVID situation changed. For example, what is happening now in part of Australia and Europe, where there is a fourth wave of infection. How do we continue to adapt in this ever-changing COVID landscape? This difficult global pandemic has brought and still bringing much suffering worldwide. Only 1% of Africa is actually currently vaccinated. It has also created a need for connection without border. Way back in March 2020, we saw that by January 2021, we would be free of this pandemic and be back face to face. This was not to come. For some, yes, for some, we are getting vaccinated. There is even booster shot. We are returning to studio in hybrid form. Yet for others, around the world are experiencing even more challenges. We are still dealing with some of the same issue of uncertainty, fear, and also the realization that we have post-COVID survivors, long COVID, breakthrough cases, all creating new sets of challenges, personally and collectively. We are still in need to adjust our life and expectation at this time, and maybe facing new challenges as the virus mutates. So how can yoga help us respond, adapt with resilience and grace to this ever-changing situation? So thank you to the technology of Zoom. In this virtual coffee, we have been reaching to senior Iyengar teachers worldwide, creating a global community of yogi interested in reflecting on our yogic practice during this time. My hope has been and still is that by hearing from different senior teachers, we can learn from each other, feel connected as we strengthen, explore the many aspects of our yoga practice in this time of crisis. So today our guest is Stephanie Quirk, a world leader in the field of yoga therapeutics. She has spent 20 years living, studying, and working directly with the Iyengar family in Pune at the Ramanani Memorial Yoga Institute. She's a New Zealander who qualified as a psychiatric nurse in New Zealand, moved to Australia in 1992, encountered Iyengar yoga in 1997 in Sydney. Having suffered many injuries due to several accidents, yoga became her lifeline. After an initial trip to Pune in 1991, she returned in 1994, where she was based for 20 years. So Stephanie is one of the very few Westerners that have spent so much time with the Iyengar and being based there. And maybe 20 years is the only one who has stayed 20 years. She has spent many years working closely with the Iyengar, assisting in the medical classes, general classes, and teacher training. Since 2002, she has been traveling and teaching to Iyengar Institute worldwide. She's now back in Sydney and teaching through the Marrickville Yoga Institute. During the pandemic, her teaching online has gone global and reached many yogis worldwide. Stephanie has said that yoga is giving purpose and meaning to her life. I came to yoga with an understanding that the path only truly opens once you wholeheartedly immerse yourself in these practices. This self-involvement is the most important part of the journey toward inner knowledge and connectedness with all our layers of ourselves. So without further ado, I want to ask you the first question, which you are one of the first very few Westerners who lived in Pune for a long period of time. It's 20 years. And I would like to start the conversation by exploring your experience with this long time staying in Pune. Why did you stay? What was your experience in living in Pune and be so close to the Iyengar? And what were your biggest challenges?
Okay. Why did I stay? I was just thinking about this over the weekend because of this program we were going to have. Why did I stay? And for me, what happened was that it kind of got to a point where I no longer left. It wasn't that I stayed. So there wasn't any desire to be going somewhere. Going home had become Pune. And a big part of this I think, really came down to the fact that unlike when you go to Pune maybe for 1 month, in which case you get very involved in the classes and going out with your friends for meals after the classes, and then back to watch another class, and back to the hotel, write some notes, and then class the next day. And that is a very rich experience, 6 classes a week at the Institute. And then you go home. What happens when you stay in Pune for an extended period of time is, first of all, you don't do 6 classes a week. You're not actually allowed to do 6 classes a week. I didn't do 20 years of 6 classes a week. You're only allowed to do 2 or 3 classes a week when you're there for a long time, depending on the numbers. So, for instance, in December and January, the numbers can get quite high. They ask us who are there for a while to actually just kind of sit back a bit, just take 2 classes or 1 class. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that I became very involved in assisting in Pune in the classes, in both the general classes as well as the medical classes. Over the years, the medical classes increased from initial 2 to 3 to 5 a week. So this was very involving. I was also involved in doing work, helping the Iyengar with their writing work. I wasn't doing the writing, I was doing the entering it into a computer part of the thing. I was also doing a study of Ayurveda at a place called Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapith, which is a university on the outskirts of Pune, and where they actually offered courses in English language. And after about 3 or 4 years, the other factor that I think kind of like, what can I say, kept me in Pune and rounded out a whole life was that my mother turned up to live also in Pune, not with me. She was living in a different situation. She is an ordained Buddhist, and she was actually doing sort of social work with with women in particular who had converted to Buddhism out of Hinduism as a way of essentially escaping the social undertowings of the caste system. So, as you know, the caste system in India very much affects everything in the society's life, not just the religious structure, but also the whole life structure. And for poor people in India, for what are known as the Dalits, there was actually quite a strong movement led by Dr. Ambedkar for conversion to Buddhism. And so my mother became involved in a Buddhist group that was actually working in particular with the women who had converted to Buddhism. So this meant I actually had family in India. So it had come to the point where it was a very rounded and a very involved life. And what I had left behind was just an address. Mm-hmm. So it was home. Yes. So it wasn't the case of should I stay? The question was never will I stay, it was always had become a question of should I go, because it was a bit like leaving a whole life or leaving home. Mm-hmm. So this is part and parcel as to why it became, I would say it's just to do with the fact that it wasn't just one aspect of my life that was involved in myself being there. I had many different parts of my life happening whilst I was in India. Because I think if you come just for classes, it's a very kind of very heightened, very intense period to go there for 6 days a week classes. But the rest of your life, the larger sphere of your life is still operating back in the country you came from. Whereas for me, the largest sphere of my life was actually happening in India. So I think that's a reason for my choosing to not leave. And it had become a situation of, it wasn't that I stayed, it was that I didn't leave.
But what was the importance of the institute and your studying there that made you stay? So,
well, I don't think it's separate from what I've just said. But yes, the institute was very important. I have an ambivalent relationship with institutions in general. I think I see on the most positive aspect as they ground for the ability to actually work through ideas, especially in this case for furthering of man's understanding of himself, that an institution can allow for that growth to happen. Whereas there's a downside to institutions, and that is the process of institutionalization. I had done 15 years working in psychiatric institutions, and I kind of know the opposite side of institutions. So it has a positive and a negative effect. It's a machine that runs. However, it's populated by people, and people that occupy various different relationships. Obviously, for me, the relationship with the Iyengar was, in a way, the deepest relationship. And but it was also populated by having interaction and association with a lot of people all working. We all had a thing in common, and that was the yoga path. The way that we were practicing together. There was a big emphasis in Pune of everyone was given not just classes, but they were also given practice times on a piece of paper by Pandu. These are your practice times. And so it was a very strong thing in Pune to, and I think that apparently it wasn't like this in the beginning, but it's something that grew and is very slowly spreading throughout the whole kind of society of Iyengar yoga. And that is the idea of actually an institution also being a place not just to come to class, but an institution being a place that one goes for practice, and you go for practice with other people who are also doing that. To a large extent, many schools outside of Pune all have leases, unless someone happens to own it, but they all have leases that have to be paid for. And so it's obviously the classes that are going to do that. But more and more places are, well, certainly the school that I have been involved with here in Australia, we have on the program actual practice, led practice. There's classes, teaching, instruction. And then there is led practice, in which a teacher will do their practice or lead a particular, maybe a specific practice of forward bends, for instance. and everyone follows along with that. No instruction is given. And this is a way of actually introducing the student to practice. So this becomes, in Pune, it becomes a very strong element. One is both having practice as well as classes with one another. This is a very powerful combination, I feel.
So continuing.
There's an author called Elizabeth D. McKellis who wrote a book on modern yoga. I don't know the title well enough. However, one of the things she coined Iyengar yoga for as being a kind of a group healing process because of the amount of stuff that we do together. Just that dynamic of, it's a bit like what they've found happens to brains when you get together and sing together. We get together and we practice together. So in the school, even though we're only just opening up after COVID, and in Pune, this was one of the powerful things that probably is underestimated in amongst people who go to Pune, is this thing of the hours that are spent, one, in class, but two, practicing together. Everyone does their own practice. It's not that there are these led practices, but everyone is doing their own practice. There can be up to 100 people. You have no idea. It gets so chaotic with everyone's equipment and props because they all have their own. But people go there to practice for the purpose of practice. It's a wonderful thing that has become, when I first turned up, the practice hall wasn't that full in Pune, but over the time that I was there, it just got fuller and fuller, and it became almost impossible to get your space. You had to get there early. Yeah. So this is a very powerful thing to have going on in your life, a very rich process, let alone the actual practice of what you're doing, what you personally are involved in. The fact that you're doing it with a whole group of other people, I don't think it can be underestimated. I actually really do believe that it is one of the most powerfully strong processes that we can undergo.
So that's really interesting. First, this is completely new to me. I mean, I knew that people practices, but I have never heard the way you're describing that importance of the practice, the time of practice with others as a therapeutic moment or as a healing moment. And that brings me to my next question. Can you help us understand what is your philosophy of yoga therapy? What?
Yeah. First of all, what I've got to say is that, you know, the thing that yoga does for all of us is it takes us through an evolutionary process. We don't know if it's taking us downhill or uphill. It's only on reflection that we can see where we've been. However, in terms of yoga therapy, I just take the word off the end. There isn't a kind of a separate department called yoga therapy. There is becoming, and obviously and clearly online, there is becoming a kind of an emphasis of teachers offering what is called remedial or medical or yoga therapy. But in actual fact, yoga, right from the very beginning, in the Yoga Sutras, for instance, right from the very beginning, it is said yoga is for the attenuation of the fluctuations in consciousness. Why? Why do we need to have a yoga to do that? And it's because those fluctuations are five. It can be categorized as five in number. They can all get grouped under 5 main headings, but they are both afflictive and non-afflictive, klesha and aklesha, klista, aklista. So anything, this is the purpose of yoga. Yoga is for the cessation of fluctuations in consciousness. Consciousness is 5, and it is klishta. So one's going to, as human beings, we are on the edge between evolution or devolution, an animalistic life or an evolving life. And we're on that edge between really our consciousness and our awareness and our lives, our social lives, everything about our lives is both klishta, aklishta. And it's for that reason that yoga really is a kind of the best so far at levelizing those fluctuations in consciousness. It's the best that human beings that themselves are klishta in their consciousness have managed to actually figure out to do. There hasn't been a fabulous being fly in from another planet that says, simple, do this, and that everything's cleared up. So ourselves, full of our own clashes, our own vrittis, our own kind of kinks in our consciousness, have to make use of that same consciousness in order to evolve. So a little bit, we have to make use of the tools in order to evolve. It's a slow process.
So that brings me to the question about
basically, so for me, there's not a special department called yoga therapy.
I see.
Yeah.
So
we do have to adapt it for some people who've got some specific problems in performing and taking hold of the tools. We have to adapt those tools or the ways that they do. But essentially, it is for the practice of yoga.
So what makes because Iyengar yoga practice so transformative? What does the practice itself help us to transform? What is it? And can you talk about what benefits of the practice?
Really, the benefit that Iyengar yoga gives, one is that it is subjective. And it is subjective in a very positive way. And by that, what I mean is the constant vacillation between the object, which we tend to throw or attribute as being ourself, and the subject, which is the actual experience of ourself. That gets, what can I say, brought into a sort of harmonious singular state. We become centered, and that process has become closer to the state of pure subjective. Mahat or cosmic consciousness is just pure subjective. It's not got the duality of objective, subjective. It can only be experienced. It's not a thing to be seen. So when actually trying to reduce the fluctuations in consciousness, you're trying to come back to the true nature of the self, then you're trying to come back to that one state. You're trying to come back closer to Mahat or cosmic consciousness, that consciousness in which you are not so separate, in which you are actually experiencing not that which is not you. Yeah. So it is that centeredness that I would say, generally, I mean, this is a bit of a global thing. The centeredness is actually true of many disciplines, not just Iyengar yoga. It is also true of other yogas. It is also true of other methods such as meditation and other pathways. However, there is an aspect to the way that Guru Iyengar, Mr. Iyengar, managed to be able to convey it to the level of the understanding of the people who were in front of him. There was a kind of a sort of an accusation about yoga and asana, that it is purely physical. Actually, to be honest with you, I think in the beginning, that is how it was conveyed. And it's because way back in the 60s, in the West, that is pretty much how things could be actually audibly heard. We couldn't hear what we couldn't understand. And so we needed to be able to understand something and then be shown just at least the next step. To get thousands of people to revere and cherish their time of practice, that they want to go to practice, is an enormous shift. An enormous shift. And this is what Iyengar did. He actually could speak the language of the people he met. And he could, through that, begin to get them to come to the next step and the next step, to a point where they realized that their view, and that they could begin to understand and realize that something had changed for them. But it needed somebody who actually had the language to speak to them. And that's what he had. In other words, he went, in particular in the beginning, to the West, and he went there and he understood, perhaps it was through his early contact with Menuhin, but he understood what it was that we would be able to understand. And he started by speaking there. And he started and he kept speaking and he kept on speaking and he kept on speaking. And you can see, you can follow a trail through his writing, that language, that message he was conveying got deeper and deeper and deeper as he took people with him. So it's, that is one of the great values. In introducing somebody to asana practice, the technicalities, the instructive discourse of what to do and how to do, as first presented from a beginner, is actually gives them a very powerful experience where they get, perhaps for not necessarily the first time, but they get a very definite experience where what they're told and what they do and what they experience are three things very close to one another. That there's nothing abstract about it. That what they're told to simply do as an instruction for an asana, and that they do it, and then they get the experience from that. That those three things actually happening aren't that common in our society, in our lives. And so this is where it sort of begins, that process of integration. And it goes on, and then you find people get a kind of a thirst for points. They like to gather the points. It's lovely when people do that, wanting to gather the points, because they've had that experience of actually enacting those instructions, those points, and having that experience that comes from that. Because they've done it in the one kind of, like you could say that the body, the physical body, is where they get the chance for truth-bearing witness, because their arms and their legs are just, they just really actually are there. It's concrete, it's there, it's feelable, it happens in the body, it's realized in the body, it's learned in the body, it's understood in the body. So the body actually, the whole way through. I was listening to a Dharma teacher recently, about a week ago, and he made a comment. He had read a text from a very early text. I haven't got it written down, but one of the things was that, you know, even after enlightenment, senses of perception and body mind and body are all still going to be there and are all still going to be actually subject to old age, sickness and decay. But it's also the only kind of like theatre in which the unfoldment of your higher potential actually happens. It happens in that same theatre as your aging, sickness, illness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You just said something really very, very important. So that resonates with me, that it's the only theater. So it's the only place that you can have all those experiences, both the positive and the negative. So, or maybe the therapeutic, depending on which language we want to use. So in this moment, what happens to our asana practice when we get into moment of crisis? Well, I'd like us to go a little bit toward the COVID situation, both in worldwide and both in Australia. But I think there is a segue here through that where you were talking about that place, the body and the mind as the only theater. So what happened when we are in crisis?
Yeah. Actually, one of the things that Mr. Iyengar did and conveyed to us, and would actually sometimes impart just straight technical advice, look, do this in this order, and it will help that condition. Okay, so he didn't, in times when people were suffering, he didn't just leave it for them to find out in the state of their suffering, because really being in that state of suffering, they are in a state of disordered despair. And so he would give them some help. And perhaps one of the most famous ones, which is two, I'll give you an example of two, but the first one is what is known, it's famously become known as the immune sequence. Yeah. And he brought this one out when SARS first came out, and it affected Pune. SARS, luckily, just kind of seems to have died of its own accord. I think SARS just basically died off before they even got a big vaccine going. But it was pretty frightful at the time. I can remember I was in Pune at the time. Everyone had masks, and so they shut the institute because it was a gathering place of too many people, so they had to close the institute. But he gave out. But what had happened was only about 4 or 5 days after a whole new bunch of people had turned up for their precious 1 month's classes in Pune, for which they had saved up to be able to come and do. And so he very kindly wrote a series of poses that they could do at home or in their hotel room. And this has become famously known as the immune sequence, because he commented, having written it, and I had to type it up and put it on the notice board. Everyone photographed it. It got passed around. Was he said that this is for the immune, to get, to boost or support or to give you this immune sequence. And there's a very simple, so we all rush home with our immune sequence and practice it at home or in our hotel rooms. And it was straight away very evident, one common thing in all of the poses, and that is the head is lower than the rest of the body. So in all of the poses, the head is made, I'm going to say, surrendered. It's made less. The body is a mountain. The head is only at the feet of the body. And it's this, one of the things that Mr. Iyengar used to talk a lot about was psychosomatic and the balance between the body and the mind. He saw a lot of problems that, in particular, coming out of Western society, we seemed to carry, was that we were much more centered in the head. And because of the discrepancy, the schism between those two, that is what led to a lot of modern day illnesses that can be attributed to stress. Yeah. And so he believed, his idea was that the failure of the immune system at times was pretty much due to this imbalance between the body or the soma and the head. And the whole of the immune sequence is getting the head to surrender whilst having the body active. So, you know, I think it starts at Uttanasana, head resting, and Adho Mukha Svanasana. It goes through all of the inverted poses plus variations, Dvipada, Viparita Dandasana, Setabandha Halasana, all the Savangasana. There's not a single twist, there's not a single seated pose, there's not a single forward bend, there is a back bend. But only so long as, in other words, as a back bend, there isn't Rajkapotasana. It's where the head is down, where the head is actually going below the level of the heart. And so this is the basis of the immune sequence. And it was to do with this balance between the psyche and the soma. What I found really fascinating, now this was good news, because it's kind of like, another time I can remember being in a therapy class, Abhijata had come up to ask him a question about somebody who had some particular problem, and it turned out it was actually immune-based. And his simple thing, his statement was very clear, and he said, oh, if it's the immune system causing this, there has to be inversions. It's just that. It's just very simply that. You don't need a whole sequence. It's that fundamental thing of try and reduce the head, get the head physically to be below the body. Now, when you're doing dog pose, you don't actually see anything other than back at your shin bones, essentially. You don't see your body, yeah? But you're in your body. And that is the main thing, is to actually to embody one's self tends to balance a lot of these problems out. And I'm not just talking about COVID and the immune system there. I'm talking about the whole stress. So what happens is the next thing that comes along is the, at the back of Light on Life, which was after SARS, the outbreak of SARS and the publication of the immune sequence, what comes next is at the back of Light on Life is poses that balance the emotions, which is quite pertinent for this particular situation of COVID and how we're affecting it. And in that, when you look at it, when you study it, it is essentially the immune system plus. It's a forward bend, there's a seated pose, there's one other pose that is not head down below the body. So he just built these things. One of the things is, I believe, Baddha Konasana, seated Baddha Konasana, in which physically the whole front body is allowed to be opened out. It's a seated pose, yeah? So this is done after all the head down, body up, immune type poses. He then opens the body out. Just before then, he actually does Paschimottanasana, head down, heart facing down, head facing down, surrendering down. You sit up, open out. So a little bit, one can talk about perhaps we have a great thirst to know medically, physiologically what is going on in the poses. And I think if you are actually really seriously doing yoga therapy, it's a good idea to know that, to know those things. I'm not actually putting that medical science side aside. But one of the things is that we sometimes can attempt to understand yoga through what we already understand, yeah? And it's a bit like how Mr. Iyengar had to use the language of what people understood, because they really literally wouldn't hear unless they understood it a bit. They wouldn't hear the language. So as we've gone along, we have in our experience of yoga and in our practices of yoga and being taught, we have become more and more sophisticated, and we now want to know what this pose does for the endocrine system and what it's doing to the circuit. So we've gone in a bit deeper, and this is great. I've always found it very interesting in the kind of like an aspect of iconography, or in the Asadala Yoga Mala series, there's one where he actually gives lines of alignment and the iconical architecture of a pose. And he chose to do a whole article of this. We had to do a whole photo shoot of this. We had to get an artist to come in to draw the lines of this for these poses. And it's kind of like, it was a really important point he was trying to get across. And I don't doubt that that man who did, by the time he died, he did what, 70, 75 years of practice every day, that he really knew something. He really understood something. And he was trying the whole time to get through to people to understand something further. And that is why we get these articles like the iconography or the iconographical architecture that exists within a practice. And in a way, you can see, you can look at what's happening in the immune sequence and the practice of poses for emotional balance. And you can see how this is affecting us. This is actually bringing in an effect. In other words, the explanation won't always be found in medical science. The explanation can often be found in perhaps the arts, in perhaps iconography, and so on and so forth. So this is what this way of working, it does require, until you kind of grasp it and really feel it in your own body, these actually are part of the answers as to why the practice of yoga is of such balancing effect in the times and in the duration of being in lockdowns and the stress and the distress of all that, that turning to practice and actually entering into that embodied architecture that is a yoga practice is actually affecting us. It is the thing that is holding our balance. It's not just the anatomy and physiology. It is the anatomy and physiology. I guess this is one of the things about asana, is that it never quite neatly fits into another discipline. We seek to find an understanding of yoga by relating it to other disciplines. Oh, it's like this. Yes, it was the six blind men and an elephant. Yeah, oh, it's like this. Oh, it's like this. Oh, well, it works because the hormone system does this. Yes, all of those things, because they've come out of good inquiry and kind of like examination of our bodies on all kinds of different subtle and gross levels. But there is something in which that undertaking, that the other aspect is that when we go to practice in a time such as COVID, we undertake acts of devotion. It is devoted to do that.
So Stephanie, this is beautiful what you're saying, and that act of devotion brings me to the question of how do we learn to surrender to the situation as we keep our safety, our sanity, whatever we want to say, but how do we learn that process of surrendering?
One of the things, I think a little bit, don't try and learn it. Well, it's a bit like learning is what happened when the teacher taught us how to write an A and a B, C on the blackboard. You know, or we had to kind of like absorb pages and pages of a book to learn a subject. Yeah. But I know what you mean. There's a thing by which it comes into us and then we know it, which means that whatever that is a process. And I suppose to say we learn it is a good way to explain that. How do we learn that? Yeah, that devotion. You actually have to have faith that it will arise. It's one of the things I think, transformation, usually one can say transformate, you only realize that something has changed after the fact. If one is figuring a transformation in front of you, well, that never occurs because the whole up in front of you will always be up in front of you. It'll never, it's got to be a time where it's got to actually be within you. So that thing of transformation, we really only kind of like clock it. Oh, I realize that I really am at peace with that it doesn't trigger me anymore. When did that happen? And it's like, you know, it actually is probably many factors of things that you were doing, that you're undertaking in the past. And so it's sort of like but what's happened is that you have changed, you have been transformed, you have, because you do go back to the practice, you suddenly realize, oh, that is devotion. That is what I'm doing. That is what I'm undertaking. I'm not talking about the institution of religion. Religion was always very strong on teasing out religion and religiosity. And that is one does a thing in what would appear to be a religious way. I think I just prefer the simple word of devotion or devoted, being devoted to doing something. And the actual, you can't undertake your practice so that you add up points of contentment. You do develop faith that the continued undertaking of the practice does bring you, I know a word you're going to come up with a bit later, resilience or stability or centeredness. I prefer the word santosh or contentment. Because it is a state in which you no longer need things outside of yourself to complete yourself with. It's santosh, contentment. And I sort of see that as being at the moment, my word for that kind of state. Stillness, simplicity, and contentment. Mm.
So you mentioned resilience. So there is I would love to have like 2 or 3 hours for you to be able to speak more about those things, but we have 1 hour, and I'd like.
Luckily for me, we don't have that time. It's not so good to be talking about it, but it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to try and think about what words to give for these.
Yeah. For the resilience.
Yeah.
But I'd like to see if we have some questions, but we can continue talking. But if some of our audience have questions that they would like to ask And could you in your reaction on the bottom of your screen, there is a reaction button. If you go there, you can push the hands that raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself and ask a question if you're so inclined. Are there any questions? No, any question is, I'm sure.
If you don't know how to use the reaction button, on most computers, it's along the very bottom bar, and it's on a Mac, it's on the right-hand side, it says reaction. You click on that, and there's a possibility of hands up. Okay, Tessa Collins. Half the screen is called Tessa Collins. You're wearing a cap with glasses at the moment. Hi.
Oh, hi.
I'm
not Tessa, but okay.
Yeah.
So you talked about the klista and aklista, and I'm wondering if you could talk about the transformation, how the aklista is a transformation of the klista, and I think you know what I'm talking about.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's an important moment.
Klista become aklista.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't quite like doing this, but I think it's an apt description. I once read this somewhere of a farmer had a particular virus going through his crop or through his orchard, and there was one tree that was affected, and it was becoming actually really kind of quite ill, and he tried chopping it down, and then another tree got affected by the same thing, and then that became ill, the leaves dropped off, it was obviously dead or dying, and he chopped that one down, and then another one. He suddenly realized, oh, this is going to keep on happening every time I try and chop down one of these diseases. So instead, he planted some more resilient trees around it that grew. So my understanding is to actually grow the good rather than chopping down the bad. That this particular process, after a while, it sort of overtakes. So I've also heard of it that there was my mother's teacher's teacher, Lama, was who does a lot of he's now dead, but it did a lot of visualization practices of different bodhisattvas. And he was asked the question, well, how and when and where do you do the practice of so many of these bodhisattvas? And he said, oh, well, as I'm brushing my teeth, I'm visualizing a certain bodhisattva. As I'm cleaning my house, I am with the qualities of a particular bodhisattva. So it wasn't so much a case of, again, it's a similar thing. It's actually undertaking the positive. I think a whole modern day thing of being positive, keeping positive thoughts is another version of it, which is actually quite true. But it sort of then became a bit packaged and it became a bit forced and had an opposite reaction. So, one of the things of actually dealing with what is essentially an obstacle is not so much to try and eradicate the obstacle so much, but to concentrate more. In other words, just try and turn back to the practice. Try and turn back to the practice. It was one of the things Guruji said when facing doubt about practice itself. Keep the doubt and go to your practice and see which one has given up. So it's kind of like, he was saying, you know, don't try and throw out, don't put so much emphasis, attention, don't shine a light on the doubt or on the negativity, because it's kind of like becomes center stage. Hi. A little bit, put more attention on the positive thing. And stay close to good friends, especially in times of COVID. No, I mean, they're obviously now online. But Calista, the 5 modifications of consciousness are that can become afflictive or non-afflictive. Sleep itself, I mean, it doesn't take much. You can spend your time trying to identify, well, you know, what afflictive modification am I in now? But again, that's kind of a bit of a mistake. The thing is to actually try and stay with your inspiration and work through that inspiration. That inspiration might be of your own practice, of other people, and so on and so forth. Even in the case of mistaken notions, a little bit, again, it's actually only through the practice, whatever that practice is that you're undertaking. It could simply be mindfulness of walking. I do a lot of walking the dog practice. And it really is a great practice, as well as sitting in an asana. But the dog has to be walked, and so I walk it. It's a very simple fact of life. Got to walk the dog. And just willingly undertaking that task that needs to be done. And just simply doing that. Oh, nice. Yes. Yes, look, honestly, trust that dear little 4-footed being. The other thing is with a certain amount of simplicity.
Yeah.
A little bit, my advice, you know, we've come up in a system in which the Iyengar are the very center of that, and they were in a very big, bustling institution in Pune. And back in our own towns and cities, we've got schools and that are in cities, invariably. A lot of them are, because that's where people are, so that's where you have to put school up. And it can be a very, very busy life. Managing the school, managing your own home, managing the family, managing the dog, and so on and so forth. It really is helpful to take as many factors as you possibly can and try and keep things simple for the sake of the practice actually just opening out for you to be able to see the changes that are coming, that shift from afflictive to non-afflictive. So there's a lot that goes in it. And this is probably a big part of the reason why the system of yoga that is given by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras, which the Iyengars hold to, they're very strong on other texts, the Bhagavad Gita and the Hatha Yoga Pradipika as well. But it's a whole rounded approach. Now, I would say that going to the sticky mat, how have I put it? Everything I do is practice, but practice isn't everything, if you can understand this. And when you look at the Ashtanga of yoga, it is a very comprehensive process. You know, it really does involve how you live in your society, how you conduct your days, how you interact socially, how you react within a society. In other words, how you actually allow yourself to just get swayed by the ekadasendriyas, the organs of action, senses of perception and mind. All of this kind of stuff, it's a very comprehensive system. And it doesn't just mean what you do on your mat. So this is why I kind of say, you know, everything I do is practice, but practice isn't everything. It's the rest of life, your relationships, your friendships, the towering tax debt that you do have to deal with is all part and parcel of it. And how you go about managing that, not just on the ledger of and bank accounts, but how you manage the shock of that in your heart, how you react to it, how you manage with the incredible sadness of the loss of a loved one. All of these things actually are what you are practicing with. It's not just on the sticky mat. And so it actually is in this way that there is this shift between afflictive and klista aklista.
Thank you. Any other questions? We can take one or two more questions, and then we'll have to close because we're after 6, and it's a pity we could keep going. Stephanie, you have so much to give us, right? And this, any questions?
Does Stephanie teach online?
Yes. Maybe I will put in the chat a message of the email address you can go to and be directed to where I am teaching online. There's a lot of recorded material as well. Okay, so that is the address of the yoga school through which I'm actually doing the online teaching. It is actually 60 kilometers away from where I live. I live on an island north of Sydney city itself, on an island in the middle of a river. So actually doing all of the online stuff has been a boon for me. It's reduced a lot of traveling. So if you just write that down now, then, and we actually have an online school and a studio school, but just go into that one address and they'll shoot you off to whatever direction you need to go to.
Any other questions you want to ask Stephanie?
I have a question, maybe a little bit of a comment. It seems like, Stephanie, you're another way of what you're saying is, like, instead of looking at obstacles as problems, like you can almost look at them as solutions, like your way on the path. Is that something that you think about at all?
Yes, I understand what you're talking about, and I have kind of read and heard of this a lot. And I don't think what I've said is any different from that, but I guess it's sort of like, in the end, it turns out that obstacle was the solution. But I don't find it quite too helpful. I'm liable to mutter to myself, somewhere in this, it will be my solution. I can, it depends how I approach it. In other words, I can kind of like get hold of a hammer and try and hammer that because it's going to be the solution. So that's a whole mental framework. Whereas a little bit, I need a more receptive mind, and it's much easier to be receptive to something of inspiration and positivity. The mind actually will, of its own accord, open up a bit, rather than trying to I know but you're right, in the end, sometimes you find an approach and you actually do find that in working with that particular difficulty that you have, that obstacle that you have, making your way through it, you learn many things. This sometimes can be a sheet of good sayings, and what one does in the end is what you ended up with. Yeah.
I think we'll take one. I think
Geraldine.
Geraldine, yeah.
Yeah. Has her hand up, and so does Priscilla.
And Priscilla.
If you're quick, we could do both, or let's see.
Let's try to do both. Yeah.
My question is quick. How much do you feel, Stephanie, that pranayama really draws that you were talking about simplicity, and that sometimes we feel overwhelmed by the asana practice, you know, wanting to do this or that, wanting to always be better, wanting to always improve. Don't you feel that, at least for me, I feel like sometimes just the breath is really the way into transformation, so that I have that time, that space to just observe and not to always be in a doing kind of state of mind?
Yes. However, some people do get a bit caught up in doing the pranayama.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But yes, and a lot of people neglect to observe in asana.
Yes, I was just thinking that sometimes I can feel myself, you know, observing the breath in the asana practice and how the different poses can sometimes affect the breath, or the breath can affect the pose. So I guess you're practicing pranayama at the same time you're doing your asana practice.
Yes. Yeah, and it's again, you will find that illustrated really nicely. There is one of the articles in the Ashtadhara Yoga Mala series where Mr. Iyengar has illustrated with arrows and things where the breath actually touches in different poses. So, and he gives an example of 4 or 5, and there are 210 asanas in Light on Yoga. 600 and something plates, but there's only actually 210 asanas. So there's a lot more to be studied there. You know, a little bit, that is an invitation where the breath touches in Paschimottanasana and where the breath touches in Shirshasana. It's very interesting. Yes.
It is.
And sometimes, I mean, in the beginning, we do have to go through those steps of learning where to put our feet, where to put our hands. We have to do that. And we do have to undertake the discipline of repeated practice, because it's only then that you start to click, I never noticed that before. You start to notice things because you've got a whole line of successive practices to compare it to.
So before Priscilla asks the question, I wanted to tag something about what Geraldine was saying, is about maybe there is an obsession in our Iyengar yoga with perfection, and what has a pandemic taught us about perfection. So I don't know if that can be, if you can answer that or just touch a little bit on that. I lost Stephanie, she's there.
I think it comes, personally, I think that, yes, we do get in slightly obsessed, or we get into a perfectionism, and often it is actually originally germinated from a desire for beauty. And sometimes trying to grasp a thing hardens it into perfectionism. That desire for beauty occurs out of one of the main Iyengar principles of alignment. And the thing is that alignment can be a little bit too much like lining up objects on, making sure that both sides of the doorway are equal and it's not tilting and you haven't got a shorter table leg and all this kind of like very obvious signs of alignment. But alignment is on so many different levels in which we are practicing. There's obviously alignment according to the position of the body parts. Mm-hmm. There's a mental alignment that comes when you notice you do differently on the right than on the left. And that requires more of a mental approach rather than a physical adjustment. And so that's going from the physical to the mental, and then it goes to the emotional, the one alignment between how you are actually within a class and outside of a class, and so on and so forth. But it is actually within our concepts of alignment, and in particular in the postures, that we have developed a quality of poise. When the alignment is true, there is the experience of poise. And if this prefrontal cortex starts to believe it's got the story on that experience of poise rather than that experience being embodied, and what we've got, what we quickly switch on to is perfectionism.
Yeah. Thank you. Priscilla, do you want to ask your question? And then we are going to have to close. Yeah.
Thank you. So my question also relates to, actually, it kind of connects to the last two questions, but also is kind of base at the same time. So I teach middle school children, and I love them, and I've been grateful that we're back in person this last spring through this fall, but I am required to wear a mask all day. And so wearing the mask for 8 or 9 hours every day with about 2 15-minute breaks. And I teach dance and movement to kids. And so I've noticed with trying to project through the mask, move and talk at the same time, that I feel like my rhythm of breath gets off, and I feel like it's hard for me to get it back and find that steadiness as I go through my day. And then at the end of the day, I feel really tired, and I feel like that's connected from this off pattern of kind of clenching and holding, and then a lot of pushing out. And I'm just wondering if you have any helpful suggestions for dealing with it through the day in part.
Yeah, one of the ways would actually be, but it's not appropriate in front of kids, to really open up the airway is the head back position. It's a thing that we sometimes do for people who are in breathing distress in the middle of an asthmatic attack, where they have, so you're forcing the out breath and you're having to form it and hold it and control it the whole time because of language, because of a little bit, I don't know, you'd have to compare, I'm not in this situation, but you would have to compare with other teachers as to what, if that's what they are doing as well. So that head back position makes the tongue recede and become very small and opens up the airway. If your mouth is open and you take your head back, we actually, for asthma, we do it by standing in a person in kind of half uttanasana with their forehead against the wall and get them to take their chin forward. It's impossible to close the airway. So that means you get a huge volume of air coming through. It's just purely kind of like, this is the reason why for resuscitation, they take their head back, because it opens up the airway. It can't get constricted. So you will get a big flow of air that comes through that. Another thing is to be in a situation and take a few deep breaths and exhale and pause and then complete the exhalation. You probably find actually that is a sort of a de-stressor, a single pause and an exhalation. In other words, Viloma with one pause is a de-stressor. Whereas many pauses in the exhalation, in other words, putting a bigger number on that doesn't do the same thing. Many pauses will make the exhalation very, very fine and subtle. Okay, so you might find that actually exhale, pause, complete the exhalation will also help with your sort of distress that's happening through that. But again, it's not a thing you can do while on the walk in the talk. You need to go somewhere, be somewhere where you can actually underdo those sorts of things. I would also think a little bit about, in other words, I guess what I hear is that you find that you need to overcome the obstacle, yeah, by getting through that obstacle. Just find out whether the kids are responding to your eye contact. You might need to go closer up to them and get the eye contact going. And in that case, you may not need to have to force the voice so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Would you like to say anything as we close, before I close the meeting? Is there anything you would like to leave us with? So thank you so much. It was a wonderful hour to have you with us, and we have learned so much. And I hope we can continue learning from you in different manners, and people might go and take classes, or maybe you'll come back to us in different ways. This was really from the heart, and thank you very much. And I also want to thank the Iyengar Association of New England and Artemis Yoga in Watertown for sponsoring those coffee. And thank you very much for everybody for coming to listen to Stephanie, and stay posted, and we'll keep you posted about the next one when we have one. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a good evening. And thank you, and from Renee, thank you very much. So
thank you all, and thank you to many names and faces I can recognize. Good to see you all.